Welcome to True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat and every scar tells a truth. Thank you for watching True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share, and tell us in the comments. Do you believe redemption still exists in a world like this? Dusty Creek was the kind of town that seemed to have been forgotten by time. A narrow street of sun-bleached wooden buildings stretched along a dry, cracked main road, the wind carrying dust in lazy swirls across the town. The saloon doors creaked as they swung in the wind, the faint sound of piano notes leaking out from inside. Horses stamped their hooves outside the stables, and the occasional shout from a distant ranch or a wandering traveler echoed across the empty landscape. It was a place where everyone knew everyone, and strangers were met with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Into this quiet, sun-scorched town rode a lone cowboy. His name was Luke Callahan, a man whose reputation preceded him more in whispers than in headlines. He rode a tall, black stallion, its muscles rippling under his steady hand. Dust clung to his worn leather coat and wide-brimmed hat, evidence of many days spent chasing cattle, outrunning storms, and skirting trouble. He was the sort of man whose eyes, calm yet sharp, seemed to measure the weight of every secret, every story, every lie around him. Luke had no wife. He had no family waiting at home. His life had been a string of temporary shelters, fleeting friendships, and endless horizons. Some might call him lonely. He called it freedom. Freedom meant no one to answer to but the open sky and the endless plains. And yet, as he rode into Dusty Creek, a subtle feeling of change stirred within him, something he could neither name nor ignore. The town's residents, few as they were, observed him from behind half-closed shutters or from the corners of the saloon. He was a man out of place, yet not threatening. His horse's hooves struck the dirt with measured confidence, each step announcing his presence without demanding attention. Luke guided his stallion toward the general store first. He needed supplies, food, a few tools, and perhaps something for the night. Inside the store, the wooden floorboards groaned under his boots. The air smelled of dried beans, leather, and the faint tang of gunpowder. The shopkeeper, a round, middle-aged man with a sunburned face, glanced up and nodded. Luke returned the gesture with a polite tilt of his hat. He moved with a quiet deliberation, picking out items one by one, careful and efficient. As he approached the counter, a sudden commotion outside drew his attention. Voices, raised and urgent, carried the edge of tension. Luke stepped to the doorway, pushing the swinging doors open, and squinted into the dusty light. At the center of the street stood a figure, unmistakable and striking, an Apache woman, her presence commanding yet poised, her dark hair flowing in the wind like a banner of defiance. She was unafraid, standing straight with a calm that made the townspeople shift uneasily in their boots. Luke studied her quietly. There was something about the way she moved, deliberate and precise, as if every step had meaning. Her eyes, dark and piercing, scanned the small crowd, settling briefly on him. In that instant, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, a challenge, a story yet to be told. The woman spoke, though her voice carried no malice, only certainty. "If you don't like your wife, I can be the second." Her words were deliberate, weighty, and carried through the heat of the afternoon like a declaration. The crowd froze, murmurs erupting as they absorbed the audacity of her statement. Luke blinked once, then a second time, the words catching him off guard. He had no wife. The statement, meant perhaps to provoke or test, hung between them like a loaded gun. Yet there was no fear in him, only curiosity, a spark of intrigue he hadn't felt in years. He studied her, noting the strength in her stance, the quiet power in her gaze, the unusual confidence of a woman who belonged entirely to herself. The townspeople murmured among themselves. Some found her words scandalous, others bold. Few had ever seen such directness in Dusty Creek, and yet Luke remained silent, allowing the tension to stretch, to twist, and settle. There was a rhythm to the moment, a pause in the world where only he and she existed, the rest of the town fading into a blur of dusty confusion. The woman shifted her weight, resting her hands lightly on her hips. Her eyes never left his, and though she said nothing more, the weight of her presence demanded acknowledgement. Luke finally exhaled, a slow, measured breath that seemed to draw the heat of the afternoon into his chest. He tipped his hat slightly, not in surrender, but in recognition. In that instant, Luke sensed a story beginning, a path diverging from the quiet, predictable life of a wandering cowboy. There was danger in her audacity, yes, but also promise. There was something about this stranger, this Apache woman, that hinted at adventure, mystery, and perhaps a collision of worlds he had never experienced. The crowd began to disperse slowly, whispers trailing behind them like ghostly echoes. Luke remained by the doorway, his mind already turning over possibilities, questions, and the faint stirrings of anticipation. The woman did not follow him. She did not need to. Her message had been delivered, and in it lay an invitation, a challenge, a beginning. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the town, Luke mounted his horse once more. He rode slowly down the main street, the stallion's hooves stirring the dust, the wind tugging at his coat. His eyes scanned the horizon, the edges of Dusty Creek, and finally settled on the figure of the woman, still standing where she had delivered her words. She was a silhouette against the amber sky, a reminder that life in Dusty Creek would never be as simple as it had seemed. Luke felt the weight of the moment settle deep in his chest. He was a man unencumbered by attachment, yet somehow the appearance of this woman had created a ripple in his carefully maintained solitude. There was a question in the air, one that neither of them had voiced but both had understood. The journey ahead promised uncertainty, perhaps peril, but undeniably it promised story, one that would change him, and perhaps the town forever. As night began to fall and the first stars pricked the velvet sky, Dusty Creek seemed smaller, quieter, yet charged with an energy that had not been there before. Luke rode toward the outskirts, the stallion's hooves drumming a steady beat against the earth, carrying him into the unknown. Behind him, the Apache woman remained a shadow of challenge and intrigue, a lingering presence that neither he nor the town could ignore. And in that moment, as the desert wind swept through the silent streets, Luke realized that Dusty Creek was no longer just another stop along the endless horizon. It had become the beginning of a story that would test his courage, his instincts, and perhaps even his heart. The sun would rise tomorrow on Dusty Creek, and with it, Luke would have to decide how deeply he was willing to step into the world that the Apache woman had unveiled. The questions she had raised lingered in the air, unresolved, daring him to explore what lay ahead. The morning sun burned through the thin veil of desert mist, casting Dusty Creek in sharp contrasts of gold and shadow. The town had woken to a quiet unease, the kind that settles after an eventful evening and leaves every resident glancing over their shoulder, wondering what will come next. Luke Callahan's presence lingered like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the small town and into the consciousness of every curious onlooker. Luke had spent the night at the edge of town, his horse tethered to a lone mesquite tree on a rise overlooking the dusty plains. The night had been silent but not empty. Stars blanketed the sky, glittering with distant fires, and the wind whispered stories through the dry grass. Yet the quiet did nothing to settle the thoughts swirling in Luke's mind. The Apache woman's words, her audacious offer, replayed over and over. They were a puzzle, a challenge wrapped in a riddle, and the sheer unexpectedness of it left him unsettled. He had no wife, never had. The concept of a second, of someone stepping into an imagined space in his life, was both absurd and compelling. The town stirred below him. Dusty Creek's residents were already emerging from their homes, cautiously resuming their routines while stealing glances toward the cowboy who had disrupted the monotony of their lives. Luke knew the town, its rhythms, its secrets, and its whispers, and yet the arrival of the Apache woman had shifted the balance. She had arrived without introduction, without warning, yet she commanded attention effortlessly. By mid-morning, Luke rode into town again, this time heading toward the sheriff's office. Sheriff Mac Callister was a man as weathered as the town itself, his face a map of sunburned ridges and lines carved by years of law enforcement and frontier hardship. Luke needed information, an understanding of who this woman was, why she had come, and what her presence meant for a man who prided himself on solitude. The sheriff listened as Luke described the encounter, his expression unreadable. McAllister had seen many unusual things in his time: shootouts over cattle, land disputes, and even a few unexplained disappearances. But there was something different about the woman Luke described. She was not aggressive in the usual sense. There was no threat of violence in her words, only a force of personality so intense that it unsettled even the most hardened cowboy bar. Outside, the town was alive with low murmurs. Merchants peeked from behind counters. Children peered from alleyways, and the clatter of horseshoes against packed dirt provided a rhythmic accompaniment to the day's slow awakening. Yet the Apache woman was nowhere to be seen. It was as if she had melted into the dust, leaving only the echo of her words behind. Luke's attention was drawn to the horizon, where the faint shimmer of heat blurred the edges of the mountains. He felt a pull, a subtle urging to explore, to follow wherever this unexpected turn might lead. There was no immediate danger, no clear reason to act yet, and that was what made it intriguing. In Dusty Creek, every stranger brought with them the potential for chaos, for excitement, or for revelation, and she was all three. The day progressed slowly. Luke moved through the town with measured steps, observing, absorbing, and calculating. He stopped at the general store, restocking supplies, and overheard the townspeople exchanging fragmented accounts of the woman's presence. Each version differed slightly. Some said she spoke only to him, others swore she had approached the blacksmith first, while a few claimed she had vanished into the hills before sunrise. The contradictions fascinated Luke, for they suggested either exaggeration or the kind of myth-making that only time and imagination could create. As the sun climbed higher, Luke found himself drawn to the outskirts of town, toward the dry riverbed that marked the western edge of Dusty Creek. It was a place where travelers paused, where the land opened into rolling plains, and where the wind carried secrets long before people ever discovered them. Here, he hoped, he might find a clue about her, a trace of movement, a footprint, a discarded item, anything to confirm that she was not simply a figment of his imagination. The land was unforgiving, the earth cracked and parched, and the occasional tumbleweed rolled lazily across the dusty expanse. Luke moved with caution, scanning the horizon for any sign of her. Then, just as he reached the crest of a small ridge, he saw it, a trail of footprints, fresh and distinct against the hard-packed soil. They were human, adult, deliberate. The direction suggested she had moved toward the canyon on the far side of the riverbed, a place shadowed and treacherous, where few ventured without purpose. Luke followed, his senses sharpening with every step. The canyon walls rose like silent sentinels, jagged and weathered, shadows stretching across the ground in long dark fingers. Here, the wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush, sun-warmed rock, and the faint trace of smoke. He paused, noting a small curl of it rising from a hidden nook in the rock formations, a sign of recent activity. Someone had been here, someone very recently. It was then that the figure emerged. She was perched on a ledge, observing him with the same intensity as before, her posture confident yet relaxed. Luke halted, realizing that despite hours of anticipation, the sight of her was still disarming. She seemed to belong to the land itself, a part of its stark beauty and harsh reality. She neither smiled nor spoke, simply watched, as though judging whether he was worthy of the path she might reveal. He did not rush. He dismounted carefully, letting the reins fall loose over the horse's neck. Every movement was deliberate, every step calculated to convey respect and caution. She had made her intentions clear the night before, but now, removed from the audience of the town, there was no performance, no spectacle, only the raw, silent challenge of two people assessing each other in the wild expanse. Hours passed with little movement. Luke circled the base of the ledge, studying the terrain, noting possible dangers and advantages. He was a man of observation, trained to notice subtleties others overlooked. Every small detail, the way she adjusted her posture, the faint stir of her hair in the wind, the echo of her presence in the canyon, added to the puzzle he was determined to solve. As the sun began its descent, casting deep shadows across the canyon, Luke realized that he had been drawn into something larger than a chance encounter. This woman was not merely bold, she was intentional. Every word, every gesture, every movement was carefully chosen, signaling a story that he was only beginning to comprehend. And yet, there was danger in that clarity. Dusty Creek had its share of threats: outlaws, claim jumpers, and the unpredictable forces of the frontier. Luke understood that the woman's arrival was no accident, and that following her path could lead to peril as easily as it could lead to revelation. But for a man who had spent years chasing freedom across endless plains, the prospect of adventure, challenge, and unknown truth was irresistible. As twilight deepened, the canyon transformed. Shadows lengthened, the air cooled, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Luke stood at the edge of the small clearing, his eyes fixed on the ledge above. The Apache woman remained, still silent, still commanding. He felt the weight of the moment settle over him, heavy and electrifying all at once. The canyon was quiet, except for the whisper of the wind, the faint rustle of distant wildlife, and the subtle heartbeat of anticipation. Luke knew that, by following this path, he was stepping into a story that had already begun long before he arrived in Dusty Creek, a story that would test his courage, his instincts, and perhaps even the limits of his solitude. And in the distance, as night approached, a flicker of movement suggested that the first chapter of this new journey was nearing its next stage. Luke tightened his grip on his hat, adjusted the reins on his horse, and prepared to ascend into the unknown, drawn forward by a presence that refused to be ignored. The canyon held secrets yet to be revealed, and Luke's journey into the heart of mystery and challenge was only beginning. The Apache woman waited, her motives hidden, her intentions veiled, and the cowboy would soon learn that Dusty Creek was only the beginning of a story far larger than the town itself. The canyon stretched like a living maze, jagged cliffs and rocky outcroppings casting deep shadows across the shifting sands. Dusty Creek had long been behind Luke Callahan, replaced now by a landscape that seemed as old as the earth itself, timeless, unforgiving, and full of secrets. The Apache woman had vanished into this terrain, leaving only a trail of small disturbances in the soil and the faint trace of smoke from a hidden fire. Luke, however, was undeterred. Each step he took echoed against stone walls, mingling with the occasional call of a distant hawk and the whisper of the wind. The canyon was a place that demanded respect. One misstep could send a man tumbling into a crevice or leave him stranded under the scorching sun, miles from water or help. Luke moved deliberately, sensing the rhythm of the land, reading the subtle clues the earth offered: the flattened brush, footprints half buried in dust, and the faint crackle of fire in the distance. Every detail was a thread in a tapestry he intended to unravel. The deeper he moved, the more he realized that the canyon was not merely a passage, but a living, breathing entity, shaped by time and the lives of those who had traveled it before. Ancient pictographs etched into the walls hinted at stories long forgotten, the marks of the Apache people who had moved silently through these lands for generations. The realization lent weight to the encounter he had witnessed in Dusty Creek. The woman was not merely audacious, she was connected to the land, to its history, and perhaps to forces he could not yet comprehend. Hours passed, the sun climbing and dipping with merciless consistency. Luke pressed on, scaling small ridges and navigating narrow gullies, the heat baking the canyon walls and reflecting back onto him in waves. Sweat ran down his back, stinging his eyes, but he ignored the discomfort. His focus was unwavering. Somewhere ahead, the faint curl of smoke had grown into a steady plume, marking a hidden enclave, a place she had chosen to remain unseen, yet deliberately revealed herself to him. At last he came upon a small clearing where the canyon walls opened enough to let the sun strike the earth directly. There, tucked between boulders, was evidence of human habitation: a carefully constructed lean-to, fire pit still warm, and signs of recent activity: footprints, broken twigs, and a few scattered tools. The meticulous arrangement spoke of someone experienced in surviving the harsh conditions, someone capable of blending into the land while remaining in full command of it. Luke dismounted, tethering his horse to a low-hanging branch. He approached cautiously, his boots crunching on the gravel, ears alert for the slightest disturbance. The air was dry and tense, the faint scent of smoke and sagebrush mingling in a way that hinted at both danger and sanctuary. His eyes scanned every crevice, every shadow, knowing that the woman he pursued was not one to allow herself to be caught unawares. Then he saw her. She was crouched near the fire pit, methodical in her movements, as if performing a ritual long practiced and precise. She had left no indication that she knew he was coming, yet Luke understood that she had allowed this approach. There was a strategy to her disappearance, a test of observation and patience, and Luke recognized that the encounter was less about confrontation and more about understanding. The canyon seemed to hush around him. Birds paused mid-flight, wind slowed its journey, and even the sun seemed to tilt in attention. Luke felt the gravity of the moment pressing against him, an invisible weight that demanded respect, focus, and patience. He could not rush this. Every decision he made in the next moments could determine whether the encounter ended in insight, peril, or lost opportunity. Hours turned to shadows. Luke observed quietly, noting the precision of her movements, the way she interacted with the environment. Every motion had purpose, gathering firewood, arranging stones, and leaving small marks that spoke a language he could only partially decipher. It was clear that she was a woman who had survived by understanding the land intimately, who knew its moods, its dangers, and its secrets. He, an outsider with respect for skill but little familiarity with these hidden intricacies, was challenged to match her awareness, step by step, moment by moment. As the light shifted toward evening, the woman finally moved, not to confront, but to reveal. She stepped onto a flat rock, elevating herself against the backdrop of the setting sun, her figure sharp and commanding. It was a deliberate display, unspoken, an invitation to follow, to engage, to witness. Luke understood immediately. The next phase of this journey was not simply survival. It was a test of courage, patience, and intuition. He approached slowly, the rocky terrain forcing him to adjust his pace. Every step was measured, every glance a calculation. He realized that she had orchestrated this encounter carefully, guiding him without overt direction, controlling the rhythm of the meeting in a way that was both subtle and unmistakable. The canyon itself seemed to recognize her authority, its walls echoing her presence, shadows stretching toward her as if acknowledging dominion. Nightfall approached, and with it came a profound clarity. The canyon, the woman, and Luke himself formed a triangle of tension, anticipation, and curiosity. He could feel the weight of history, the unseen currents of past stories etched into the walls around him, influencing every decision he made. The air cooled, the shadows deepened, and the faint hum of nocturnal life began to stir in the underbrush. Luke settled near the edge of the clearing, maintaining visibility while keeping his presence subtle. The woman remained on her rock, watching, waiting, silent but intentional. He realized then that the encounter was about more than a fleeting challenge. It was an introduction, a reckoning, a bridge into a story that promised transformation. The canyon seemed endless, yet in its vastness a path forward began to emerge. Luke understood that the woman was both guide and gatekeeper, a living embodiment of the wild terrain, and that following her would require more than bravery. It would demand trust, observation, and an understanding of a world he had only glimpsed. As darkness settled, the fire pit flickered shadows across the canyon walls, casting long, undulating patterns that danced like specters. Luke watched the movements carefully, absorbing the details, understanding that every small action carried weight, meaning, and a signal. The woman's presence was a story in motion, and he had become part of it whether he fully comprehended the implications or not. In the stillness of the canyon night, a subtle tension hovered, unresolved, expectant, and charged with possibility. Luke knew that the hours to come would test his endurance, his insight, and his ability to navigate a complex landscape of challenge and revelation. The Apache woman's audacity, first observed in Dusty Creek, had revealed itself to be only the surface of something far more intricate and demanding. And so the night deepened, wrapping the canyon in shadows and mystery. Luke, the cowboy without a wife, found himself drawn deeper into a story orchestrated with deliberate precision, a story that promised danger, revelation, and a confrontation with truths he had never faced. The canyon held its breath, the fire flickered in silence, and Luke's path forward remained uncertain. The Apache woman had set the stage, and the next chapter of the journey would demand that he move beyond observation into active engagement with a world that was as unforgiving as it was mesmerizing. Night had fully descended upon the canyon, swallowing the landscape in darkness that felt almost tangible. Luke Callahan sat near the edge of the fire pit, the glow of embers illuminating his weathered features and casting long, flickering shadows against the jagged canyon walls. He could hear the faint rustle of animals moving in the brush, the distant cry of a coyote, and the whisper of wind against stone. The air was dry, heavy with the scent of sage and burning wood, and every sound was amplified in the stillness. The Apache woman remained on her perch, her figure a dark silhouette against the faint glow of the horizon where the last traces of daylight clung stubbornly to the canyon rim. She did not speak, nor did she move unnecessarily. Every small gesture, tilt of the head, shift of weight, the manner in which her eyes scanned the terrain, was deliberate, communicating a command of her surroundings that Luke both admired and feared. He had spent hours observing her, mapping her movements, deciphering patterns. The more he watched, the clearer it became that she was not merely testing his patience or curiosity. She was evaluating him, silently judging his ability to endure, to adapt, and to remain focused in the face of a challenge. This was a woman who understood the power of presence, who knew that dominance did not always come through words, and whose control of the environment made her a force impossible to ignore. Luke shifted, careful to avoid disturbing the embers. His hand grazed the grip of his revolver, more out of habit than necessity. Here, weapons were only tools, extensions of skill, not answers to questions that required perception, patience, and understanding. The landscape itself was a challenge. The canyon demanded vigilance, respect, and a sharp awareness that could not be dulled by arrogance or bravado. He recalled her words from Dusty Creek, the audacious suggestion that had seemed absurd at the time. They had resonated in his mind ever since, a puzzle he could not ignore. The irony of a statement meant for a man with a wife now revealed as a metaphorical challenge only deepened the intrigue. She was a woman unbound by convention, fearless in approach, and determined to test the limits of anyone who crossed her path. The night grew colder, the air sharpening around Luke like a blade. Shadows lengthened and merged, creating illusions that played tricks on the senses. The Apache woman moved with precision, retrieving a small bundle from her lean-to, arranging it with careful deliberation. Each motion had a rhythm, a fluidity that suggested years of survival in unforgiving conditions. Luke studied her, noting the grace and the efficiency, understanding that these were not merely survival skills, they were lessons in control, patience, and dominance over one's environment. A distant owl hooted, and Luke realized that the canyon had transformed into a theater of tension. The fire, the shadows, and the silent standoff created a dynamic that was as thrilling as it was unnerving. He felt an unspoken pressure to act, to prove himself capable of navigating not just the land, but the intricate dance she had orchestrated. The woman had set the rules, and it was up to him to meet them, or fail. Hours passed without further motion. Luke's senses heightened, every sound a potential signal, every flicker of light a clue. The canyon, once a static backdrop, had become an active participant in the story. He moved closer to the rock where she had perched, careful to remain in view but not to provoke. The distance between them was deliberate, a gap charged with anticipation, and Luke understood that any misstep could alter the delicate balance. Then, as the moon rose, the woman began to move. She descended the rock with a fluidity that was almost predatory, her footsteps silent, yet purposeful. Luke mirrored her motions, careful, measured, and deliberate, maintaining the rhythm she had established. The canyon seemed to respond, the shadows shifting in concert with their movements, the air vibrating subtly with the tension between observer and observed. She led him through narrow corridors of stone, over ridges that required careful footing, and past hidden alcoves that hinted at the canyon's secrets. Luke followed, understanding that this journey was more than a physical test. It was a lesson in awareness, intuition, and trust. Every choice he made was being watched, every reaction catalogued. The woman was shaping him as much as the terrain itself was shaping their path. By the time they reached a secluded plateau, the canyon had revealed another layer of its character. Here, the walls opened slightly, offering a panoramic view of the plains below, the town of Dusty Creek, a distant cluster of wooden structures. The wind swept through the plateau, carrying the scent of earth, smoke, and distant grass fires. The woman stopped, surveying the landscape with a quiet authority. Luke, standing a respectful distance behind, realized that this plateau was not merely a vantage point. It was a stage, carefully chosen to test perspective, patience, and judgment. The moonlight illuminated small markings in the stone, pictographs and carvings that spoke of the land's history and the presence of generations of Apache who had moved through these canyons with grace and precision. Luke felt the weight of ancestry pressing on the moment, understanding that this encounter was not just personal, it was a crossing of worlds, a collision of histories, and a test of his ability to respect both. Night deepened, and with it came a sense of inevitability. Luke knew that the canyon, the woman, and the journey ahead were inexorably linked. He could retreat, return to Dusty Creek, and leave the mystery unresolved. Or he could step forward, embracing the challenge she had laid before him, and risk exposure to forces, both natural and human, that he had yet to fully understand. The Apache woman, still silent, turned her gaze toward him, her posture relaxed yet commanding. Luke felt the weight of her scrutiny, the unspoken demand for insight, courage, and understanding. He recognized in that gaze an invitation, an opening into a world where every choice mattered, where every observation could mean survival or failure. As the night stretched on, the canyon seemed to pulse with anticipation. Shadows lengthened, the embers of the fire whispered in the wind, and Luke understood that he had crossed into a territory where conventional rules no longer applied. He was no longer simply a cowboy traversing land. He had become a participant in a test of endurance, perception, and resilience, orchestrated by a woman whose audacity surpassed mere words. And in that stillness, Luke realized the magnitude of the journey ahead. The canyon was both a crucible and a guide, the Apache woman both mentor and mystery. The choices he made in the coming hours would shape the trajectory of his path, challenge the limits of his solitude, and perhaps even redefine the contours of his identity. The plateau, the moon, and the canyon held their secrets tightly. Luke had taken the first steps into understanding, but the deeper trials awaited. The next chapter would demand action, insight, and courage beyond what he had faced before, as the woman's intentions began to reveal themselves in ways both dangerous and transformative. The first light of dawn spilled into the canyon, painting jagged cliffs in hues of gold and crimson. Shadows retreated, but the air remained tense, heavy with anticipation. Luke Callahan had spent the night on the plateau, awake for most of it, observing the Apache woman as she moved with quiet efficiency, preparing her small camp for the day ahead. Every movement was deliberate, measured, a study in control and survival that demanded recognition. Luke himself had scarcely slept. The night had offered him no comfort, only the weight of anticipation and a deep awareness that the challenges ahead would test more than his endurance. They would test his insight, his judgment, and his instincts. He had followed her through the canyon for hours, learning its rhythms, noting its hidden dangers, and piecing together the subtle signals she left behind. Each step forward was a lesson in patience, each pause a reminder that the land and the woman were entwined in a delicate, uncompromising order. As the sun rose higher, the canyon revealed new complexities. Narrow passages opened to hidden alcoves, shallow streams trickled through rock formations, and distant ridges promised both sanctuary and danger. Luke understood that every feature of the landscape was a test, and the woman had mastered its language. Her every choice of path, every subtle signal, communicated not just where to go, but how to move, how to observe, and how to survive. The morning was silent except for the faint sounds of wildlife and the occasional rustle of wind. Luke trailed her at a careful distance, mindful of every step, every noise, and every shadow. The canyon was not merely a backdrop, it was a participant, a living entity that demanded respect, and he had to match its rhythm to continue. By mid-morning, they reached a narrow gorge, the walls steep and unforgiving. The sun struck intermittently through the jagged cliffs, illuminating the dust and debris that littered the canyon floor. Here, Luke realized the challenge was escalating. The woman moved with remarkable agility, testing his physical skill and his awareness simultaneously. Rocks shifted underfoot, loose gravel threatened balance, and the canyon seemed to conspire with her, presenting obstacles that would deter the unprepared. Luke's muscles strained, his boots sliding against gravel, arms bracing against walls, and yet he pressed on, driven by a mixture of curiosity and the instinctive recognition that this journey was unlike any other he had undertaken. The woman led with silent authority, her eyes scanning every detail, her posture relaxed but commanding. Luke sensed that she was gauging his ability not only to follow, but to adapt, to anticipate, and to respond to the unexpected. The gorge opened into a small clearing, hidden from view, where the canyon walls formed a protective barrier. Here, the woman paused, crouching beside a cluster of stones that marked an old campfire, remnants of travelers long gone. Luke noted the precision with which she inspected the site, checking for signs of intrusion, for tracks, and for hidden dangers. It was clear that she was a master of the environment, a woman whose survival depended not on chance but on acute observation, skill, and intuition. Luke approached cautiously, maintaining a respectful distance. The clearing was more than a temporary resting place. It was a proving ground. He realized that the woman's intentions were no longer merely enigmatic, they were purposeful. She was creating conditions, crafting scenarios, and orchestrating experiences designed to measure his capacity to engage with the land, its dangers, and its hidden truths. As the day progressed, Luke began to understand the rhythm of the test. Every path chosen, every pause taken, and every observation made by the woman held significance. He noticed the subtleties, how she moved silently to avoid disturbing the wildlife, how she read the terrain for potential threats, and how she manipulated her presence to communicate without words. Luke recognized that this was not just a trial of endurance, but of perception, strategy, and insight. By late afternoon, the canyon narrowed into a treacherous pass, cliffs rising sharply on either side, shadows deepening in anticipation of evening. The terrain demanded focus and careful navigation. Luke found himself stepping lightly, scanning constantly for loose rocks, hidden dips, and subtle signals she might leave. The canyon had become a crucible, forging awareness and resilience with every careful step. Suddenly, a distant rumble echoed through the gorge. Luke froze, sensing movement beyond what he could immediately perceive. The woman, ever vigilant, had already shifted her posture, scanning the canyon with unerring precision. Moments later, a group of riders appeared on the distant ridge, their approach slow but deliberate. Luke realized they were outlaws, opportunists perhaps, drawn by the faint traces of activity in the canyon. The woman's presence had been a lure, a test that might now escalate into danger. Luke tightened his grip on his revolver, though instinct and caution dictated that he maintain composure. The canyon amplified sound, turning even minor movements into exaggerated signals. The woman moved with grace, positioning herself and Luke to observe without exposing themselves. She had anticipated the threat, calculated the possibilities, and prepared a response. Luke realized then that the test extended beyond endurance and perception. It encompassed courage under pressure, the ability to adapt, and the skill to survive under immediate threat. Hours stretched as they monitored the riders, who moved hesitantly, unsure of what lay in the canyon below. Luke's understanding deepened. The woman's audacity in Dusty Creek, her deliberate orchestration of paths and pauses, all pointed to an innate mastery of both terrain and strategy. Every detail mattered, every decision carried consequences, and the canyon itself seemed to acknowledge her authority. As twilight approached, the riders retreated, their caution dictated by uncertainty and the unforgiving landscape. Luke exhaled, a mix of relief and admiration flooding through him. The woman had orchestrated the encounter not merely as a test of physical ability, but as a lesson in situational awareness, patience, and strategy. Her intentions, once enigmatic, were gradually revealing a pattern. She was not merely audacious, she was deliberate, precise, and unyielding in her mastery of the environment. The canyon fell into quiet once more, shadows stretching across the terrain, embers from the fire glowing faintly in the dim light. Luke recognized the significance of what had transpired. The day had been a crucible, shaping his perception, patience, and endurance. He was no longer merely a cowboy traversing unfamiliar terrain. He was a participant in a carefully orchestrated journey, one that demanded insight, courage, and respect. As night descended, the plateau seemed suspended in anticipation. Luke observed the woman as she maintained her vigil, silent but commanding. He understood that the final stage of the journey, the ultimate test, was approaching. The canyon had revealed its complexity, its challenges, and its secrets, but the lessons were not yet complete. The edge of reckoning awaited, and Luke's next choices would determine not only survival but understanding, mastery, and perhaps transformation. The canyon settled into darkness, holding its secrets tightly. Luke had survived the trials of endurance and perception, but the ultimate test remained. The Apache woman's intentions, the true purpose of the journey, and the final revelation were still to come. The next chapter would bring the conclusion, where choices and courage would shape destiny. The first light of dawn touched the canyon rim with soft amber, spilling into the hidden alcove where Luke Callahan and the Apache woman had spent the night in tense anticipation. The air was cool, filled with the earthy scent of stone, sagebrush, and the faint remnants of the fire that had kept darkness at bay. Luke rose slowly, stretching the stiffness from his limbs. The previous days had tested every facet of his endurance, perception, and courage. Now, as the canyon slowly came to life with the hum of morning, he sensed that the final stage of this journey had arrived. The Apache woman was already awake, seated on a rock, her posture calm and commanding. She scanned the horizon with a practiced eye, the sun catching the edges of her features in a way that emphasized both her strength and the mystery that had surrounded her since Dusty Creek. Luke studied her silently, recognizing that every step of their journey had been deliberate, every challenge carefully crafted to prepare him for what lay ahead. The canyon, which had felt like both a sanctuary and a crucible, seemed to hold its breath. Shadows retreated before the morning light, and the distant plains shimmered with the promise of open land. But Luke knew that the true trial was not in the terrain. It was in the choices that awaited, the understanding that had been seeded over days of observation, pursuit, and endurance. The woman rose, moving with fluid precision toward a narrow passage that led deeper into the canyon. Luke followed, adjusting his pace to match hers. The walls of rock closed around them, the air thick with the scent of earth and the faint echo of unseen streams. Every footfall was deliberate. The canyon demanded respect, and Luke had learned the language of its subtleties, the cadence of its warnings, and the grace of its hidden opportunities. Hours passed as they navigated the intricate labyrinth of stone, each turn revealing new challenges, unstable ledges, hidden ravines, and narrow paths that tested balance and focus. Luke's muscles ached, his senses sharpened, and yet he pressed on, understanding that the woman's orchestration was not only physical, it was a test of judgment, resilience, and adaptability. At last, the canyon opened into a secluded basin, shielded from view by jagged cliffs. The sun illuminated a small natural spring, its waters clear and reflective, surrounded by lush vegetation that seemed improbable in the harsh desert terrain. This hidden oasis, untouched and serene, spoke of survival, patience, and knowledge of the land that only a few possessed. Luke realized that the woman had led him here deliberately, not merely as a destination, but as a revelation. She paused at the edge of the spring, turning to face him. Her eyes, dark and piercing, reflected a history and strength forged through survival and mastery of the wilderness. Luke understood, in a quiet, profound way, that the journey had been a lesson in more than courage. It had been a demonstration of insight, observation, and respect for the untamed forces of the world and the forces within oneself. The canyon around them seemed almost sacred in the morning light. Birds flitted through the trees, and the faint ripple of the spring's surface mirrored the sky above. Luke's mind traced the journey they had undertaken, The initial encounter in Dusty Creek, the pursuit through the twisting canyon, the tests of endurance and perception, and the subtle lessons embedded in every movement, every pause, every shadow. He realized that each moment had been orchestrated to reveal not just the landscape, but the character, instincts, and choices of the one who followed. Luke knelt by the spring, letting the cold water trickle through his fingers. The sensation was both refreshing and grounding. He glanced at the woman, who watched him with an inscrutable expression, and felt a subtle shift in the energy between them. There was no declaration, no overt invitation, only the quiet acknowledgement of shared understanding, forged through trial, observation, and resilience. The canyon had tested him physically and mentally, but the ultimate lesson was in perception, the ability to recognize patterns, anticipate danger, and appreciate subtle truths that could be overlooked by those less attentive. The Apache woman had been both guide and challenge, revealing that courage alone was insufficient without awareness, patience, and respect for forces larger than oneself. As the day progressed, Luke and the woman began to make their way back toward the canyon's mouth. The path was familiar now, yet every step demanded continued attention. Luke moved with confidence, his senses attuned to the land, aware of both immediate and distant hazards, and respectful of the delicate balance that had guided them thus far. The canyon, once threatening in its complexity, now seemed to recognize his understanding, its passages yielding smoothly, its challenges met with readiness and skill. Upon emerging from the canyon, Dusty Creek appeared in the distance, a cluster of wooden buildings, stables, and dusty streets, bathed in golden afternoon light. Luke's journey had transformed him. The town seemed smaller, simpler, almost insignificant against the vastness of the trials he had endured. Yet the Apache woman remained a presence that could not be ignored, a reminder that courage, perception, and resilience were cultivated not in comfort but in challenge. The descent into the town was quiet. Luke rode slowly, absorbing the final moments of the journey, aware that the experiences within the canyon had reshaped not only his understanding of the landscape but of himself. The woman's influence was subtle yet profound. Her audacity in Dusty Creek now understood as an invitation to engage with a world far more complex than he had imagined. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across Dusty Creek, Luke felt a rare sense of closure. The journey had demanded everything he had to give: endurance, observation, courage, and respect, and had rewarded him with understanding, insight, and a renewed sense of purpose. The Apache woman, enigmatic yet deliberate, had not simply tested him, she had guided him toward a recognition of his own capacities, his instincts, and his ability to navigate the unpredictable. The canyon behind them seemed to sigh in the fading light, holding its secrets and stories close, a silent witness to the trials and transformations that had taken place. Luke knew that the lessons he had learned would endure far beyond the boundaries of Dusty Creek, that the journey through shadow, challenge, and revelation had altered the trajectory of his life in ways subtle yet profound. As night fell over the plains, the Apache woman finally moved with deliberate finality, disappearing into the shadows of the town's outskirts. Luke watched her leave, aware that her role in this chapter had concluded, yet the impact of her presence would remain. He felt gratitude, respect, and a profound sense of connection to both the land and the journey he had undertaken. Luke returned to the center of Dusty Creek, the town quiet, ordinary, yet transformed in his perception. The encounters, the tests, and the revelations of the canyon had reshaped him. He understood that solitude was not merely freedom, but responsibility, the responsibility to perceive, to endure, and to respect the hidden rhythms of the world. In the quiet of Dusty Creek, with the horizon painted in shades of red and gold, Luke Callahan rode on, forever changed by the presence of a woman whose audacity had sparked a journey of insight, courage, and self-discovery. The Apache woman, a shadow, a guide, and a force of nature, had left an indelible mark, not as a companion in the conventional sense, but as a catalyst for transformation, a living testament to the power of challenge, perception, and understanding. And so, the canyon, The town and the journey became one in memory, a story of courage, endurance, and revelation, where the unexpected encounter in Dusty Creek had led a solitary cowboy into a landscape of trials, lessons, and profound understanding, forever altering the horizon he would ride toward.